Do you know what? It's been so long since I did my first Ironman that I forgot which year it was. So although in my briefing to Zita I said it was 2015, it was actually 2014. I realized that when I was looking back through the photos to prepare my talk for today. But I'll come back to that. So yes, it was 12 years ago this year. It doesn't seem that long ago, although it clearly was. Um, as Zita said, I'm the youngest of three brothers with severe haemophilia. Before I kick off, I just want to say thank you very much, firstly to the HC for inviting me to speak. I spoke about this quite a lot around the time and after I completed my races and things, and I actually haven't spoken about it for a little while. So it's nice to dust off and remind myself of what I used to do. But equally, thank you all for taking the time out to join us this evening. And please feel free to ask anything. I'll do my best to pass on the benefit of my experience. And you'll see there actually, interestingly, from the photo, that was a photo in 2018, that in the background it says Kuala Lumpur. And obviously for those going to WFH Congress, that will eventually be this year. So it feels like we've been talking about Kuala Lumpur for some time. In terms of me and who I am, as it says, I'm the youngest of three brothers with severe haemophilia A. I have a twin brother. He's an identical twin, and I'm 4 minutes younger than him. And we were diagnosed, fortunately, at birth, and that was as a result of my older brother, who also has haemophilia, being diagnosed shortly after he was born. We didn't know of any family history of haemophilia, but when my mother was pregnant with my older brother, my grandmother had made a comment about the fact that her brother had sadly bled to death when he was around 2 years old. And this was probably around 100 years ago now, probably around 1920, somewhere around there. So she made a comment, and because of that, when my older brother was born in the October, he was tested for haemophilia. It took a while. They kept the motorcycle taking the blood kept getting lost on the way to the hospital in the days before Google Maps, and so I think he eventually had three blood tests, and finally the sample made it to London, and he was diagnosed in the January with severe haemophilia A. Because of that, my twin brother and I were tested immediately when we were born, and we were diagnosed within about 2 weeks. So we didn't go through the diagnostic odyssey that many people do in terms of bruising and going to the hospital and being checked for various conditions. It was a relatively simple and straightforward diagnosis. All three of us were patients at the world famous Great Ormond Street Hospital in London until we were aged 18, and I'm now at the Royal Free Hospital in London. Although I live in Yorkshire, I live about 3 or 4 hours away. But because I spent so much time living in London and got to know my team, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but because I have such a strong and good relationship with my team, I still feel that I want to go back to London to go to my visits because I feel that that's where I receive the best care, not just because of the treatment I receive, but because of the fact that those people know me. Um, so in terms of what we're going to talk about today, as I say, 2014, so that's a typo, my fault. I became the first person in the world to complete an Ironman triathlon. So what does that constitute? Well, there's the start is a 3.8 kilometer swim, normally in a lake or a lagoon somewhere. And my first one was in Zurich, so I actually got to swim in Lake Zurich, which was relatively pleasant, and the water temperature was quite mild. It was in the low 20s. You then follow that with a 180-kilometer bike. For any cycling fans, that's similar to the distance of a stage of the Tour de France most days. And then at the end, you run 42.2 kilometers, which, as you all know, is the distance of a marathon. Um, and some questions I often get asked about that, is that all in one day, or do you do it over several days and all those, or do you get to have a rest and break in the middle? And the answer to all of those questions is no. It's not over separate days. It's all on one day. You usually start at some ungodly hour at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and usually finish in the late afternoon, early evening if you're quick enough. Um, Having completed my first Ironman triathlon back in 2018, that photo I've just shown was from Glasgow and the World WFH Congress. I was invited to speak about that at the WFH Congress. One of the other members of the panel I spoke on that day characterized my achievement as irresponsible. So the question I'm going to pose to you all today was whether I was irresponsible, and I'll let you come to your own conclusions on that. In terms of the early years growing up with severe haemophilia, I appreciate I'm very lucky to have grown up in the Western world and in a developed country where we have excellent healthcare and free healthcare on the National Health Service here in the UK. And my the early years involved being treated on demand. So when I had a bleed, I had to go to the hospital. I would receive my factor, and then I would go home. I don't ever remember being hospitalised, maybe overnight once or twice, but never being in hospital for a long period of time. Um, the challenge, however, as I say, as you can see there, is that because I was one of three boys with severe haemophilia, it meant that if one of us had a bleed, we all went to the hospital. So it became a bit of a family outing. I don't say this lightly, but hospital wasn't a second home. It was home because I spent so much time there rather than actually being at home and sleeping in my own bed. The hospital wasn't particularly close. If you were very lucky, you might be able to get there in an hour and a half or so. But otherwise, the journeys there could be several hours, and then coming home was several hours. But that was really the closest centre that we had at the time. Um, I do remember growing up, particularly being at that age, I remember a lot of time being in pain, particularly with ankle bleeds and elbow bleeds. I remember not being able to sleep at night because I'd be kept awake by the pain. I would have my ankles strapped and in splints, and sometimes just turning my leg over, the weight would shift and it would just be too much and it would be throbbing. So I do remember that it affected my sleep a lot of the time and being in significant pain. As a result of that, mobility and getting around was an issue. I remember shuffling a lot of the time or hopping up and down. I became very good at hopping on my right leg. I'll talk to you about my left ankle in a moment. But I became very good at getting around. I had to make do with what we had. Um, in terms of those bleeds quickly took their toll. And I don't know exactly why. I don't remember what the catalyst was for it, but my left elbow initially became my target joint. And I can maybe show you now, but I can't, for example, I can't touch my left shoulder with my left arm and my left hand, and I'm fine with this one. But I genuinely cannot remember a time in my life when I was able to straighten my left arm or when I was able to completely flex it and touch my shoulder. And I don't know why that was. I don't know whether I knocked my elbow, why it specifically became the target joint. I'm right-handed, so you might think if I was going to use one hand more than the other, it might have been my right, but it wasn't. Growing up, I slept with a splint on it at night to try and straighten it and reduce the flexion that I now don't have. But that was to no avail. And as I say, since around the age of 5, I've not really been able to straighten my left arm. That hampers me in terms of lifting weights and exercising and swimming because I can't straighten my arm. And even just sitting on a bike, I'm not able to completely straighten that arm. So my body tends to rotate slightly more because my right arm is comfortable. Um, it causes issues still day to day. So things like simply carrying the shopping. I can't carry the shopping bags in my left arm for very long. Sometimes if I walk to the supermarket, I might take a rucksack with me and put the shopping in there, and so I can put it over my shoulders so it's not an issue. Equally, when traveling to things like EHC conferences and other things, carrying bags and traveling around the airport, those sorts of things can take its toll and cause it to ache. Um, it also, as I say, impacts my ability, along with my ankles, to engage in sports, and as a result, probably makes me an unlikely athlete in many ways. Um, my left elbow really pales into insignificance though behind my left ankle because growing up that really was my worst affected joint. I remember now going to school. If I was lucky, I would be able to walk for maybe 1 week out of 4. The rest of that time, was when I was walking, I would have a splint which would be strapped around my ankle and it'd go up the back of my leg as well. So it's quite obvious to anyone, particularly at that age. I was wearing shorts to school as we always did, even in winter, I think. And it was quite obvious that I had this splint up my leg. And when I wasn't, I would be in a wheelchair or I'd be on crutches. It depended what day it was, which I'd be in, because sometimes my two brothers would have bleeds too, and they wouldn't be able to walk. And sometimes it was a case of who was the worst would get the wheelchair because we didn't have wheelchairs for all of us. We couldn't fit them all in the car. We could get one wheelchair in, and sometimes the others would be on crutches. And some days we all went to school with ankle bleeds. But my mum was always very encouraging and making sure we got to school to make sure we had an education, and that's certainly been of benefit later on in life. When I was at school, I rarely left the classroom at break times or spent any time in the playground. I would spend it in the classroom. I was allowed to stay there. Usually have a friend. And of course, in the summer, no one wanted to stay in with you because it was hot and they wanted to be outside. And in the winter, when it snowed or it rained, everyone wanted to be your friend and stay inside with you. So you knew who your friends were. Um, I did do a bit of PE, physical education, as we call it in the UK. That was limited. And I remember having to wear a big padded helmet on my head whenever I did any of that in case I fell and obviously hit my head. The only good thing about that was I was able to put my A-team stickers on there. For those of you old enough to remember the A-team on television, I had stickers from my sticker album, and I put some of them on my helmet to make me try and look a bit less dorky with my big padded helmet on. Because I spent so much time on crutches and in a wheelchair, it resulted in a lot of muscle wastage in my left leg. And if you were to look at the two of them together, you would see that one is significantly smaller than the other. And that was simply because I wasn't on it and I wasn't using it. And I'll come back to you and talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. When I got to around the age of 9 or 10, I started on prophylaxis, and I think it's an important opportunity to step back and not just considering myself and where I was with my treatment, but where we were as a community, particularly in certain countries like the UK. The mentality from doctors changed around treating haemophilia, and instead of treating the bleed, instead of cure, we went to prevention. And that was a huge moment when the medical profession decided that this was the optimal way to treat people with bleeding disorders. Instead of waiting for them to have a problem, let's see if we can prevent them in the first place. Because we know now, don't we, that even one bleed can have such long-term consequences and damage for people. So that was a really important moment for me. And I don't say that this lightly, but it was like a switch being flicked in my life. I stopped bleeding within a week or two when I was injecting 3 times a week. And although I was injecting 3 times a week, I was probably injecting less than when I did have bleeds, because when I did have bleeds, I'd often have to treat in the morning, I'd have to treat at night, I'd have to treat the next day, and that might happen several times a week. So the number of injections went down as well. So actually 3 times a week doing it, taking 10 minutes before school, became relatively simple and straightforward. Um, Up until that time, in terms of exercise, in terms of what I'd been doing, it had been very limited. Like many of you, I'm sure, my parents were recommended to take us swimming because it's quite hard to injure yourself swimming, and it's good for the body. It works muscles that other sports don't. So that was very much encouraged, and indeed, I did go swimming every week and used to have swimming lessons. I wasn't particularly quick, but I was relatively confident in the pool. I used to cycle at home, usually on my bike, just around where I lived, and came off a few times, like most people, and grazed my knees and elbows. I put football and question mark. I don't really remember at that time playing football at school. It would have been too competitive and too dangerous in terms of being injured. But I do remember kicking a football around at home with my brothers, for example, where both of them knew not to be too rough, etc., and vice versa with me and them. But very soon I became largely bleed free. And I can say that the burden of illness reduced because I was having fewer injections, and certainly the trips to hospital reduced as well. So it meant that just being able to go to school and have a relatively normal life and education became possible. So it really was like a switch being flicked in my life. Um, there's a picture of me and my twin brother. I'll let you guess which one's which, whether I'm on the left or on the right. I know which one's me, but see if you can guess. But in terms of school, this was just before I moved to school when I was about 11. And it was important because when I moved school, because I wasn't bleeding anymore, only a few people from my old school came to the new school. So hardly anyone at the new school even knew I had haemophilia. And like many of you, I'm sure I tried to hide my condition because I wanted to be normal. And I did feel largely normal. And on occasion, I would still go in on crutches. But I'm sure, like you, at most schools, there was usually somebody who'd broken their arm or was on crutches from a sporting injury. So it wasn't unusual for me to be on crutches occasionally, and I didn't really get any questions about it. Whereas before, because I was on crutches or in a wheelchair constantly, of course, it inevitably attracted questions. And as I say, it meant I was able to focus on school, and I was just able to focus on playing in the playground with my friends and not sitting in the classroom all the time, which was a huge change. Treatment and change of school coincided, and it was a very happy coincidence for me, and I think for my twin brother as well. I'm going to fast forward a bit. I left school at 18. I stayed on and did my A levels in the UK, and I went to university. I read law at university and became a barrister, what we call a barrister in the UK, a lawyer for many of you, or an advocate, as some European countries call them. I used to wear one of those funny horsehair wigs and gowns when I appeared in court. And I practiced criminal law for 11 years. I used to go to court and conduct trials, jury trials, as we still have over here at the moment. And in terms of fitness and exercise, in terms of what I was doing, I was active. I was keeping fit generally. I was simply going to the gym, but nothing really more than that. And I wasn't really pushing myself at all. But I felt okay. I wasn't bleeding, and I was able to go to the gym probably three, maybe four times a week. Okay. In terms of what I was doing at the time, it was nowhere near the level of what was about to come in the following years, which I never anticipated or never foresaw. I was still treating prophylactically. I think the product I was treating on had changed, but I was still on what we would call a standard half-life now. And in fact, I completed all my Ironmans whilst on standard half-life, not even on an extended half-life. Um, in my late 20s, I had some friends who were doing some running and doing some triathlons, and a group of them were training for a triathlon. And I hadn't really heard about triathlons at the time. And one Sunday, a group of them were going swimming. And so I went along with them and I bought the newspaper. And I sat down and I read the newspaper while they were all swimming. And after they finished, about an hour or so later, they said they were going to go back next week. And I asked about hiring a wetsuit, and they said, yes, you can hire one. So I thought the next week, I thought I'll see what it's like. So the following week, I hired a wetsuit and I went swimming because I thought, how hard could it be? I used to swim a lot as a child. And I did swim, and I have to say, I became a little bit hooked. I was doing a little bit of running around that time, but not much at all, maybe once or twice a week. And that year, that was probably around 2011, 2012, I decided to enter a short distance triathlon. Um, Despite that, my ankles were still sore, so every time I ran, my ankles were quite sore, so I had to be very careful and didn't really run too much. Um, I think it's fair to say that I got a little bit carried away and thought I could do a little bit more than was possible. And I started running three times a week, and some days I was running day on two consecutive days. And after about 3 weeks, I was in a situation where I was at home and I'd got up to go to work one morning, and I put my foot over the bed, and it just felt like the blood rushed into my ankle, and it was agonizing, and I was in a lot of pain, and I could just about hobble to get to the bathroom and back. And I went straight back to bed, and I didn't go to work that day. And in fact, I didn't go to work for the next 3 weeks because I couldn't walk because of the pain I was in. And I was at home. I had crutches at home, and I hadn't used them for years. And in fact, I think when I moved, I'd actually contemplated throwing them away because I thought I'm never going to need those again. Unfortunately, I didn't, because I needed them, and I needed them a lot. And it took a long time. I went to the hospital and saw my physio. And at the time, as I say, as a lawyer, I was self-employed, and not working was a huge problem for me. And I remember the first time after those 3 weeks walking again, because it felt like I'd gone back 20 years where I was when I was a child, not being able to go out and walk all the time. And it really did feel like it had taken me back 20 years, my condition. And I was finally able to walk again, and I was able to attend a good friend's wedding, which was a huge relief. Um, and I slowly started to go back to work, although on one day I did have to go home again in agony, and I think I had a day or two off. So it was a significant setback in terms of what I thought I might be able to do with my haemophilia, and it really was a sense check in terms of the fact that I did still have haemophilia. It hadn't gone away, and it was still limiting to an extent what I was able to do. This, for those of you, a quick X-ray of my ankle. I with my left ankle, I can't move it very much, so the dorsiflexion and that, it doesn't move very far at all. It's quite rigid, which sometimes helps a bit, particularly with running. It's not so easy when I'm twisting and moving a bit more, but certainly going forward and back, I can just about cope with it. But as I say, there's an X-ray of my ankle. Um, because of what I'd experienced, because of what I wanted to do, and because of what I've experienced, I realized that I couldn't do it in the same way that other people could, people without haemophilia. as I've mentioned, because of my ankle bleeds and the muscle wastage on my left leg, my left side was hugely problematic. So my right side, my right leg and ankle probably would have been able to do what I wanted to, but it certainly couldn't cope with support doing what it needed to do and supporting the left leg. And as a result, I started going to the gym a lot more. And I spent about 18 months working on my weaknesses, certainly in terms of the muscles that are in my legs. I spoke to my physiotherapist at the hospital, who was incredibly helpful and supportive in terms of giving me exercises and helping me with what I needed to do. And I built up to a stage where I was able to actually run a half marathon, which was a huge achievement after 18 months, considering where I was when I wasn't even able to walk for 3 weeks or be able to go to work. So in terms of approaching this differently, what I realized is it was the running and it was the impact on my ankles that were causing the significant problems. And so I had to come at this from a different angle. And so helpfully, having started to be interested in triathlon, cross training is what I needed to do. I need, as well as running, I needed to go to the gym, but swimming and cycling were also very helpful because I could increase my fitness by doing those, but I didn't necessarily need to be running all the time to improve just my running. That enabled me to reduce the stress and strain on my ankle a lot and enabled me to exercise as much as I wanted to. And during the first year of this new training regime I'd effectively devised for myself with my physio, I was able to complete three short distance triathlons. Um, when I started off with all of this, I certainly didn't start off from zero thinking, I know I want to complete an Ironman triathlon. And I engaged in something that personal trainers and others refer to as progressive overload. So when you go to the gym, you might progressively start lifting bigger weights. And I think I took the same approach when it came to triathlon. So I started off with a very short distance, then with a slightly longer distance the year after, and then longer and longer each year. And I certainly didn't spend a month or two in doing one distance, then increase it. So it literally was a whole year I would spend at that distance before then increasing it the following year. So as I say, I certainly didn't start off all this exercise and training with the intention of completing an Ironman. Initially, I have to confess that I thought even people without haemophilia who were doing Ironmans, I thought they were a bit extreme and a bit out there. And I certainly thought that will never be me, even if I didn't have haemophilia. I'm not sure if I wanted to do that. Um, so the following year, I did decide to increase the distance of the triathlons I wanted to do. And all went well in the second year. And the following year, the third year after that, I thought a half Ironman might be possible. And that consists of a nearly 2.2 kilometer swim, a 90-kilometer bike, and then a half marathon at the end. And I say by this time I'd run a half marathon, so I knew that I was capable of doing that. It was simply whether I was capable of doing that and doing the other two distances and disciplines beforehand. Pausing there, I just want to mention what was going on in terms of my haemophilia and my haemophilia team. I was very much settled at the Royal Free at that time and had a very good relationship with my team. My physiotherapist, I think it was really helpful that he was active himself. So when he was asking me what I was up to, I would always be asking what him was up to, and we'd be comparing and seeing what was possible still with haemophilia. And I discussed very early on triathlons, and he'd been supportive because he saw the benefit of not just running all the time. He thought swimming and cycling, that was a great idea, and going to the gym, complementing what I was doing with my running. So to that extent, he'd been very encouraging and supporting. But I have to confess that very early on in one of our conversations, he was very firm with me that I shouldn't get any ideas about running a marathon. He was firmly, and even now, I think if you spoke to him, he's very firmly of the view that marathons are not a good idea for normal people. They're just not good for the joints and the body and everything else, let alone people with haemophilia. So he was very clear about his views on marathons. You'll be pleased to know that I took on board his advice, and I didn't disappoint him because I didn't get any ideas whatsoever about running a marathon. I didn't have any of those ridiculous ideas. So in 2014, so it must have been, because I've got my dates wrong, haven't I? It must have been 2013 now. I completed two half Ironmans, so the distance I've just talked about. I did one in the May, I think it was, and then one in the September. And that was all I'd really targeted. I thought that's probably going to be the end. I'm not going to go any further than that. And I never really had any ideas beyond that. But following the second race in the September, something started to niggle, not even at the back of my mind, but somewhere a little bit further forward. Something started niggling at me because I thought, well, I did both of those. And whilst I was tired and exhausted at the end, I still felt like I could push my body a little bit further. How much further, I didn't know. And so the question was, what did I do with that feeling? Well, I wouldn't be here now if I hadn't done something about it, would I? So we talked, and I talked to my physio, and of course I didn't tell him I wanted to do a marathon. I told him I wanted to do a 3.8 kilometer swim, a 180 kilometer bike ride, and then run a marathon. And in fairness to him, I still remember his face when I told him. I'll never forget it. He didn't say no, and that was really important because had he said no, I probably wouldn't have done it. I might have, but I don't think I would. If he'd said to me, no, I don't think that's possible, or I don't think you should be doing it, I don't think that's sensible, I would have listened to him and I wouldn't have said no. I would have said no. Um, I have to say, I was scared. I was nervous. I was excited, of course, as well, to the extent that I hadn't even mentioned it to my parents or close family at the time, because I was scared of saying it without having spoken to my clinicians. So I knew that if I'd spoken to my physio and spoken to my doctor and I had their support, that that would be a far easier conversation to have with them because I had um, I had that help and support. And so it was that I set about training for an Ironman. I knew a little bit of what it entailed from the previous year, but things ramped up significantly. So it meant lots of early nights, no drinking, eating well. And I have to say, it's a bit antisocial training for an Ironman. So we'd go out, and in fairness, people liked it at times because I was the designated driver, so that was always quite helpful. So it did have its upsides. And then I'd usually be up early in the morning doing things, and while other people were lying in. So it did have its upsides at times. But in terms of managing my haemophilia, I came up with a relatively simple system. And I did that by treating myself, so giving myself my fat on the days I was running, because I knew that was going to put the greatest strain on my body. I knew that the impact on the ankles and my joints was always going to be the opportunity for my body to potentially bleed. And so I was able to prevent that by running on the days that I was treating, or treating on the days I was running, however you want to look at it. And that worked for me. That system really worked, and that was really. It sounds simple now, even looking back at it, but it was something that really clicked in terms of my training. I always had Mondays off, had a full rest day when I was training for those Ironmans because you need to give your body time to absorb all of that training. Um, and so it was that in 2014, rather than 2015, as we said at the start, I completed, and I was the first person in the world to complete an Ironman triathlon on the 27th of July 2014. I came home, crossed the finish line in around 11 hours and 46 minutes. That was following, as you can see, beautiful Lake Zurich there in the photos, a 3.8 kilometer swim, 180 kilometer bike ride around the Swiss countryside, lots of hills and climbs and things, and then a run around the top of Lake Zurich and then into the city to finish of 42.2 kilometers, so a marathon at the end. And unsurprisingly, at the end, I was absolutely shattered. Um, the day afterwards, they refer to it as the Ironman shuffle. I was always going to be limping with my ankle, but going to the airport and just walking around town, you can always see the other people who did the Ironman the day before because they have a particular look about them. Usually very hungry, usually very tired, and usually limping and shuffling around a bit. So, and so it was. As I say, in 2014, I completed Ironman Zurich. Since then, I've completed three more. So I completed Ironman Frankfurt, another race in Germany called Challenge Roth, and Ironman Copenhagen, which was a beautiful race as well, very scenic too. I trained for two more, so I think had I done five, I would have left it alone. I trained for two more during COVID, and both of them were cancelled. They're not cancelled 6 months out either. They tend to be cancelled about 6 weeks or a month out, which is a bit of a problem because you've usually done most of the hard work and the training by then. So I did all that training, and nothing came of either of those races, which was disappointing because I say I would have liked to have done five and left it alone. I think since then I can safely say I think I'm done with Ironman. I don't think I'll ever go back and do another one unless something drastic happens. But equally, I think it's important for me to acknowledge At the same time, it wasn't just me who was doing these things. Others were completing their own challenges. People who are well known to the community, people like Chris Bombardier. And I want to mention two other people from the UK. So Jack Bridge, for example, was the first person with severe haemophilia to appear to compete at the Paralympics, and he competed at the Paralympics back in 2012 in London. Since then, as you all probably know, there's a rower from Canada who competed at the Paralympics in Tokyo. And last year in Paris, there is a British haemophiliac called Ed Fuller who actually won gold at the Paralympics last year. So we've had three people with severe haemophilia compete at the Paralympics, along with people like Chris Bombardier and several others. And I think we're each on our own journeys in terms of what we were doing, but I think the same thought occurred to all of us, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. I'll just mention that many of us came together in July 2024 to try and climb Mont Blanc. There is a documentary on YouTube which you can watch about that. So have a look at that. That was a very fascinating week spent in Chamonix with lots of other people with haemophilia trying to climb Mont Blanc. So since then, I've not been as active. Who would be as active as when you are training for an Ironman? But what it has given me is given me a lifelong appreciation of exercise, not just as someone with haemophilia, but as a human being. In particular, in relation to my haemophilia, I think it's fair to say that I bleed less, I hurt less, and I move more. And in terms of being called irresponsible, I actually don't use more factor. I use less. And I don't trouble my centre as much. I hopefully trouble them less. And I certainly don't trouble my family and friends with worrying or having to take me to hospital, for example, when something drastic has happened, because my condition is very much under control. I control my haemophilia. My haemophilia does not control me. And so, was I irresponsible? Well, that's a question that only you can answer. But in terms of my own reflections, I obviously did something no one else had done before. And that thought that occurred to people like Chris Bombardier and Jack Bridge and Ed Fuller, for example, was the same as occurred to me, namely that if treatment is improving for people with bleeding disorders, then why aren't the expectations of what we can do improving too? So it wasn't just me. So the question is not just whether I was irresponsible or whether we're all irresponsible. And I'll leave you with this thought, because I think where we are now in terms of sport and exercise and certainly strength and what we do, we don't, my feeling is that we don't talk so much about what it's safe to do with haemophilia or with a bleeding disorder, but we talk about how to do it safely. So the question of whether or not someone with haemophilia or bleeding disorder should be doing something, I don't think that's a question anymore. That's my view. I think the only question is, how do you do that safely and how do you do it responsibly? And I think it was highlighted to me. There's a Facebook group in the UK for people with haemophilia. And there was a comment recently about football, and a mother was asking about football and her son. And the question she posed in that group is that her son's playing football. Can anyone make any recommendations for shin pads that he should be wearing? And there were lots of useful and helpful comments underneath. But not one person said, should your son really be playing football? 5 years ago, if you'd looked in that same group, though, I think the question would have been different. Not how do I play football safely, or should my son be playing football at all? So I think that was a really good indication of where we are. But finally, and I think maybe the best illustration I've come across of this was recently from a conversation I had with a mother with a son with haemophilia at the end of last year. And I was having lunch with her, my partner and I, and she'd been speaking at this conference with her about her son and football and the fact he plays football 5 times a week. And I asked her about her mother's guilt and whether she felt guilty that her son has haemophilia. And she said, no. She said, I don't feel guilty that my son has haemophilia because I don't feel his haemophilia limits him in any way anymore. And I can say with confidence that that's the first time I've ever spoken to a mother with a son with haemophilia, or any parent with a child with a bleeding disorder, who's ever said that they don't feel guilt about their child having their condition. And so I feel that we really have moved on, we really have progressed, and that the stronger we are, the more we're able to move, and the more resilient we are, and the more we can deal with our bleeding disorders. Thank you very much.